Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, we're talking about something we use all the time, but oftentimes don't think much about. The interstate and the interstate system. We're going to talk about its good parts, its bad parts, why it's so controversial even as it was being constructed, and why the interstate is slowly but surely, in some select cases, being torn down. This is the Cameron Journal podcast, and we're talking about the interstate. This is the Cameron Journal podcast. It's a place where we talk about important things. It's a place where we bring a little slice of the news to you. It's a place where we do important things, have important conversations. It's also things that I like to talk about. My name is Cameron Cowan, and this is the Cameron Journal podcast. The title is obscure, but its impact is not. The Federal Highway Act of 1956 created the Interstate Highway System, which touched virtually every aspect of American life in the past 50 years. Louis Jacobson, roll call, May 3rd, 2005. As long as the interstate is the highway supporting our society, economy, and national security, it will forever need to be the beneficiary of our attention and investment. The ribbon cuttings will never end. Dan McNichol, The Roads That Built America, The Incredible Story of the U.S. Interstate System, 2003. The world's largest public works project has reshaped the American landscape and way of life. U.S. News & World Report, 2003. It is a journey with no end. Americans crave mobility, and wheels will always need roads. George Constable and Bob Somerville, A Century of Innovation, 20 Engineering Achievements That Transformed Our Lives, 2003. Fed by the prosperity of the last decade, the 46,567-mile network of limited-access roads that make up the interstate system is a linear economy on wheels, a distinct and self-sustaining 51st state, in a sense, that generates life and commerce. Peter T. Kilborn, The New York Times, July 14th, 2001. Not surprisingly, the most frequently selected influence on the metropolis in the past 50 years was the interstate highway system. Dr. Robert Fishman for the Fannie Mae Foundation. Top 10 Influences from the Past 50 Years of American Cities. October 21st, 1999. The Interstate Highway Act literally brought Americans closer together. We were connected city to city, town to town, family to family as we'd never been before. The law did more to bring Americans together than any other law in this century. President Bill Clinton, February 8th, 1996. I can tell by the number of trucks on I-75 how the economy is doing, says Stephen Schrantz, Executive Vice President of a large Cincinnati-based lender. The Wall Street Journal, January 31st, 1996. The interstate system works, in fact. It has exceeded its original scope and mission by revolutionizing the nation's logistics, changing the way we travel, and knitting the country's regions closer together. Thanks to constant redesign and reconstruction, the interstate remains a vital part of the U.S. economy. Daniel J. McConville, American Heritage of Invention Technology, Fall, 1995.
More and more and more cars. More on our roads than last year. And there'll be more next year. And the year after that, more and more cars will be built and more cars will be bought. And Every one of them will be entitled to room on our roads and highways. The thing is, will there always be room for one more car? Well, there isn't even enough room now. Today, many of our highways are already obsolete. What would happen on them during a national emergency? The entire population under panic conditions trying to escape. Death on the highways is one of America's greatest problems. Major factors in this mounting loss of life are the roads and highways themselves. They are not engineered for safety or for the number of cars now using them. President Eisenhower's militant call for a grand plan to provide a modern controlled access highway system for safe, efficient transcontinental travel led to the passage of the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. He dramatically underscored the fact that our interstate road network is inadequate locally and obsolete nationally. The President has led the way to positive action. Public road engineers have long been making plans to meet the growing emergency of highway obsolescence. They have worked with scientific detachment to create the interstate highway system that we need today and must have in the future. Mr. Gunderson, one of the community's most successful farmers. Mr. Huggins is a pretty important farmer, too. Emma Glock is the chairman of the Hilldale Historical and Civic Beautification Committee, and it's largely due to her that Hilldale is one of the prettiest and cleanest little towns in the state. Sally owns a neat little coffee shop, and Bill, who has a service station and garage, eats there, and so does Ben, who has a motel close by. Today, Mayor Willits is presiding.
The other evening, my 7-year-old daughter, Gracie, asked me what I thought was going to be a very difficult question. So I began with the birds and the bees. But she frowned and shook her head and said, "I know all that old stuff, Daddy. What I want to know is, where do all the automobiles come from?"
No piece of infrastructure has had the effect on the everyday life of Americans than the interstate. The Dwight D. Eisenhower National System of Interstate and Defense Highways was created in 1956 by the Federal Highway and Defense Act. Since then, 45,000 miles of interstate highway have been built crisscrossing the United States and creating little loops in Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. Interstates are remarkable for their consistency. The lanes are a constant width, no fewer than 2 in each direction. There are shoulders on each side, clear signs, lighting in urban areas, and they don't have intersections. You can get on in one direction or get off, but all of the roads pass over or under. Interstates do not have stoplights unless they end and connect with other large roads. Most importantly, cars can travel in one direction, separated from the opposing direction with a median or guardrail, and travel at a relatively high speed. Interstates have a certain magic about them. They have a culture and they define driving in this country. They are the envy of the world. They have enabled our modern economy to travel ever faster over this large continent. Although associated with the 60s and 70s, much of the interstate system was still being completed as late as 1992. It was once said that America was great because of the interstate. However, the history of this unique system of highways is complicated, to say the least. Much of the history of how interstates crossed America and sliced through cities is now being discussed as the aging system needs to be replaced. The needs and the tastes of the public have changed. Advocates for high-speed rail and mass transportation are agitating to divert dollars away from highways and into mass transit. As it turns out, the discussion has been going on since the system was first conceived.
It will benefit us tremendously economically. It's of vital importance to national and civil defense, and it'll make life easier and more enjoyable for all of us. Thank you.
There is a myth, often told, that the interstate system was inspired by a terrible 90-day trip taken by a young officer named Dwight D. Eisenhower. Frustrated with the slow progress on the trip during World War I from west to east, he envisioned a new way to get from coast to coast. The answer arrived when he saw the German Autobahns during his invasion of Europe in World War II. When he became president, he wanted to bring these new roads to America, and as the story goes, the interstate system was born. The truth is a bit more complex, but this is the original interstate myth. It's amazing how a network of roads can have myths about them. We humans always need a story for something. The trip was one of the truths in that story. Eisenhower really did make a trip that took 90 days from west to east. However, the Germans weren't the first to have multi-lane roads that traveled in one direction. Those already existed. The innovation was on-ramps and exit ramps without the interruption of cross-traffic. The Germans did add the standardization of shoulders and lanes so that no matter where you went, the road would look the same and drivers knew how to navigate them. However, the interstate system was hardly Eisenhower's idea, and we'll get back to that in a moment. Before we have any conversation about the interstate system, we have to think first about what preceded them and why they were necessary.
My name is Harper. I work in the bank. When a freeway is put through a community such as ours, what factors determine the exact route?
I'm going to call on Mr. Anderson, our planning engineer, to answer that question because it comes under his department.
Even before any field work is started, many months of preliminary planning and engineering have been done. The first step in actual location begins with a careful field survey, most of which is done from the air. Now, this special camera photographs the terrain understudy in 3 dimensions. The stereoptic 3-dimensional photographs are then interpreted and measured. This method greatly reduces time and costs. Surveys, which used to take 10 to 12 months, are now completed in 2 or 3. Electronic brains are used with great savings.
In the middle of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln made 2 very crucial decisions that would change the look of America forever. Construction began on the familiar dome of the U.S. Capitol. It would be completed in 1866. However, Lincoln and others in Congress wanted to join the country from east to west, not just north to south. The early plans for a transcontinental railroad began. Lincoln, of course, would not live to see the completion of the dome or the railroad. In 1869, the first transcontinental railroad across the United States linking San Francisco to New York via rail would be completed. The final spike of the railroad was driven into the rail tie in Ogden, Utah on May the 10th. Americans had been moving west since the 1840s. America had slowly grown out west since the Louisiana Purchase in 1804. Wagon trains began crossing the vast expanse of the American West. By the 1830s, people were filling into what we now call the Midwest, but the manifest destiny of Western expansion could not be stopped, and the immigrants in their wagons kept coming. Although the Oregon Trail is the most famous of these wagon trails, there were crude dirt trails dotted with settlements and towns across the American West. The Santa Fe Trail snaked south as the Oregon Trail snaked north to the Pacific Northwest. These trails transported people, the mail, and stagecoaches. But the reality is that traveling in this manner was dirty, slow, and unreliable. One could travel to the west coast via ship, but the Panama Canal wouldn't be built for another 80 years. Ships were obliged to travel around Cape Horn off the tip of South America and then up the coast, past Mexico, and back to the United States. Traveling by ship was only marginally faster than traveling over land, but both of them had their dangers. Many ships would be lost in the fierce storms around Cape Horn. Travelers over land faced starvation, thirst from a lack of water, and frequent attacks by Native American tribes defending themselves against westward expansion, as had their eastern cousins 200 years before. The problem was wagons were too slow and ships too dangerous. However, the steam engine had begot the railroads, and they were faster over land, relatively safer, and more reliable than pack animals. Congress acquired the land necessary and let the railroad companies bicker over how to build the railroad. They started from each side of the country with much fanfare and ever so slowly began building the new railroad. Maps of most of the country were crude at best, and so surveyors on site would decide the path of the rails. They cut hills, built bridges, and advanced the rails. New towns popped up along the railroad. Cheyenne, Laramie, and several towns in Nebraska owe their very existence to the railroad. Rails. That is the mass transportation and the original transcontinental transportation system. However, railroads have their issues. It still took almost a week to travel from the East Coast by rail. It was 18 hours by express change from Chicago to New York, much less farther west. Trains had to stop at stations. People also had to switch to local trains to go to specific destinations. Railroads didn't go quite everywhere. Once off the rails, people still had to use ground transportation. At first, this would have been horses and wagons, but then Henry Ford created the first cheap automobile that anyone could buy using the assembly line. This innovation would be the first nail in the coffin of passenger rail and much of America's mass transit infrastructure. The car would revolutionize transportation and change the way the country was built in the 20th century.
The equipment distributors, too, perform a vital service by furnishing and servicing the machinery. Then there are the suppliers of material, such as aggregate, cement, asphalt, tar, corrugated steel pipe, aluminum for lighting fixtures, bridge rails and signs, and steel for massive bridges, guardrails, lighting standards, wire mesh, and other reinforcing. And last, but certainly not least, is the army of workmen employed by the highway contractors.
How do we know we're getting our money's worth, and who gets these contracts?
All the jobs are advertised publicly, and qualified contractors are invited to bid in accordance with our American system of free competitive enterprise. Anyone else, please?
My daughter-in-law, Etta, well, she's married to John, and they live over in West Forks. The freeway's already been built over there. They think it's just wonderful, but I've been wondering about these great, big, dangerous machines. All the clatter and dust and confusion. How long are we going to have to put up with such goings-on?
Well, those big machines are not really dangerous because they're handled by experienced men, trained to operate with safety, both for the workmen and for the public, under the skilled eyes of safety engineers. Of course, there's bound to be some inconvenience in a project of this size, but the work around Hilldale won't take nearly as long as you might think. Everything moves fast because the engineers and workmen are sure of themselves. Today, we move mountains out of the way instead of going around them. Coordination is modern and thorough. There's no waiting around. Our modern designs with long sight distances and gentle sweeping curves are made possible by our great earth-moving machines. On the biggest jobs, we are actually able to move up to 30 tons of earth in a single carrier at 25 miles an hour. And modern paving machines unwind the ribbons of road before our eyes at an unbelievable rate.
Land Goshen.
If there are no further questions, the hearing is closed. Thank you all for coming.
Could I see you for a minute, please? All I got to say is it's a lucky thing for them I don't own any property where they're going to put that thing.
You know, Staveley, I think it's kind of lucky for all of us that you don't.
Yeah.
I'll get Dad. Registered letter for you, Dad.
Registered letter?
The need for a highway system was evident with the rising popularity of the automobile and the seemingly choked streets that shared space with people, the occasional buggy, and animals. The first plans for a highway system beyond the ribbons of two-lane roads that snaked across the landscape was planned as early as 1939, but interrupted by World War II. Despite that, the plan to replace the U.S. highway system was revived in 1944 and wound its way through the halls of Congress until 1956. The original interstate system took 20 years to build, and its success across the country was primarily due to funding. The federal government, often at the behest of car companies like GM, Ford, and Chrysler, and other industry groups like the American Road Builders Association, or ARBA, who encouraged the federal government to promote the use of cars with new highways. Even tire companies got in on the action. Old U.S. highways were being used beyond capacity. Congress approved the Federal Highway and Defense Act in 1956. After that, construction was quickly begun.
Joe, turn the TV set off.
Oh,
Turn it off.
Well, what is it, John?
It's from the Highway Commissioner.
Highway Commissioner?
We have found it necessary in locating the new Interstate and National Defense Highway in the Hilldale area to acquire your property for right-of-way, and would like to arrange at your convenience a meeting with our appraisers and negotiators to establish a fair value and arrange the terms of the purchase.
You mean the freeway is going to come through our place?
That's what the letter says.
They have no right to do this. This is the Harper place. It always has been, and it always will be. I'm not going to have these highway people come in here and tear out our good trees and turn the house into rubble. No. These are my trees. And when those bulldozers come, they'll find me sitting right here in this chair. And if they're going to take the house and the trees, well, they'll take me too.
Joe, run out and tell Grandma to come back in the house. The bulldozers won't be here for 2 or 3 months yet.
yes, Dad.
From interesting engineering, here's the general course of construction of the interstate system. There are some major milestones as the system was completed. Missouri was the first state off the block when on August 13th, 1956, work began in St. Charles County on US 40, which is now called I-70. On September 26, 1956, Kansas kicked off its portion of I-70, and additional milestones include October 17th, 1974, Nebraska becomes the first state to complete all its interstate highways when the final piece of I-80 is dedicated. October 12th, 1979, I-5 is dedicated near Stockton, California, linking Canada to Mexico and making it the first contiguous freeway connecting the North American countries. On August 22nd, 1986, the last section of I-80 is completed in Salt Lake City, Utah, making it the first coast-to-coast highway going from San Francisco, California to Teaneck, New Jersey. It is the world's first continuous freeway to span the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. August 10th, 1990, the final section of the southerly coast-to-coast I-10 is completed in Phoenix, Arizona, linking Santa Monica, California to Jacksonville, Florida. September 12, 1991, the final section of the northerly coast-to-coast I-90 is completed near Wallace, Idaho, linking Seattle, Washington to Boston, Massachusetts. On October 14, 1992, the interstate highway system is considered finished with the completion of I-70 through Glenwood Canyon in Colorado. It is considered to be an engineering marvel with a 12-mile span containing 40 bridges and numerous tunnels. The cost of the interstate system was not just limited to its construction. It's the cost everyone who owns a car bears to have them. Funding issues were reached early on, and eventually Congress would raise the gas tax in 1961 to continue financing the expansion of the interstate system. The gasoline tax goes into a highway trust fund, and there's also the cost of owning a car. There's maintenance, insurance, and gas to consider. The interstate is pretty useless without cars. Also, there's the amount of land needed to park all the cars and the cost to keep them. The interstate enabled automobile culture in a way that probably wouldn't have happened if interstates hadn't been built, and certainly not in cities. And stick a pin in that because it's going to be important later. A quick side note. Unlike the railroad or the wagon train, construction was taken up locally, so there are no good TV shows about people moving from coast to coast building this infrastructure. The federal government let the states do the lion's share of the work, so it was up to the states to find construction contractors and build their own portions of the highway system in one sort of plan that was managed by the Department of Defense. Now, it is also important to note when it comes to cost, DOD was in charge of the interstate system until the mid-70s when the Department of Transportation took over. Now, states, when it comes to maintenance and all that sort of thing, tend to deal with most of the interstate maintenance with block grants to the states. So the interstate system, while being a federal project, is also an interesting bit of 10th Amendment flair, where the states do most of the work and make most of the decisions about the interstate system as long as they keep to the overall national plan and maintain federal interstate standards. The reality is this cost is borne a great deal by local taxpayers as much as anyone else. While the federal government does pay for some of the construction and maintenance of the interstate system, it's oftentimes the states that kick in a great deal of money as well. So it takes multiple funding models in order to keep the interstate moving the way that it should. So despite the federal standards, through gas taxes, both at the federal and local level, we're all still bearing the cost of it. Anyone who buys gas, any product that uses fuel to move, any product that goes on the interstate system, or if they crosses areas where there are tolls, there's portions of I-70 in Kansas that are tolled, portions of I-90 that are tolled. There's some parts of the East Coast you can't hardly move 10 feet without someone asking for a toll. So the interstate system is definitely a costly bit of infrastructure, despite its tremendous ability to move things east to west, north to south, and in every other direction around the country. One of the things that makes the interstate system unique is the fact that it tends to bypass a lot of the small towns. When they built the U.S. highway system, they connected every single small town. So the U.S. highway system snaked around the land, and it just went absolutely everywhere. The interstates did not. The interstates would only go to major cities and every state capital except Juneau, because Juneau's on an island. You have to get there by ferry. And this oftentimes meant that a lot of the small roadside motels, roadside attractions, all this type of thing that had become popular in the 20s and 30s suddenly had no traffic because everything had moved over to the interstate. A man named Charles Kuralt, who was a CBS correspondent for years and years, once famously said, "You can travel across the United States on the interstate system and see absolutely nothing." The interstates are many things: efficient, fast, consistent, usually well maintained, depending on where you are. But they do lack that certain amount of romantic driving panache that the U.S. highway system had. Charles Kuralt did a series of road trips in the 60s, 70s, and 80s where he would rent an RV. They'd paint it up with CBS logos and everything. And he would drive around the country to see some of the sites that the interstate had left behind. Here's some clips of Charles Kuralt.
Roads where Kansas still looks like Kansas, and Georgia still looks like Georgia, where there is room for diversity and for the occurrence of small miracles. I mean, you'd never have to slow down on Interstate 80 to let a herd of horses cross. Happens all the time on the country roads around Cumbie, Texas. And since what we are looking for along the country roads are those old ornery virtues of cussedness and nonconformity, Cumbie, Texas is a pretty good place to start. It's been said that if you have any affection for the Old West, or a touch of larceny in your soul, or both, you'll get along fine with Ben K. Green.
That's the way about horses. One thing about having horses is that you'll always have a few gate and fence problems. They wouldn't feel good if they didn't cause you a little trouble now and then.
Let the wet green mosses of one hillside stand for all the deep silences of our country. And then, listen. We have not been enthralled by every American sound or sight. We have had cause to reflect on the American boast that we carved a country out of the wilderness. In Montana, we'd have settled for the wilderness back again. This was grassland in Illinois once. It grows a fine crop of burger joints now. One day in the desert, I had a vision. that the last ding-dong of doom had sounded, that the land was empty, and that the last American had left only one small monument to mark his passing.
On the Road with Charles Carrault. This broadcast was sponsored by Ford Motor Company. Ford's better idea. We listen better, and we'd like to hear from you.
I have fallen in love with American names. So have we, Mr. Benet. All those places, named out of patriotism, some of them, or convenience, or humor, or hope. All those places, all those lovely names. Sweet Home, and Hoodoo, and Sisters, and Bend. And Stella, Kentucky. That's where we made the acquaintance of another American original, a gent named Moses Walters. People like Jesse Mitchell help them turn back the clock. He used to be a Pullman steward. He brings his old skills out of retirement on trips like this one from New York to New Orleans.
Railroad is something that gets into your blood, and something you don't want to get away from once you get into it. See the number one.
The Black Diamond rolls on. Nothing is ever lost if there are those who will save it. There are faster ways to get around now. Faster, but not as fine. You can race the clock, or you can be lulled by its ticking. You can fly over all this, or you can see it at leisure from a private rail car, a thread pulled by a needle through the fabric of America. You can step out of a plane in New Orleans, or you can arrive. The interstate highway system speeds traffic along in this country, but not always in winter. For generations, people heading east to west in Wyoming went through Rock River, Medicine Bow, and on to Rawlins. Now you can save 14 miles by taking Interstate 80 over the mountains. We have a piece of advice for you. Don't try it. It's I-80, but people around here call it the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We did try it on a balmy, sunny day, as nice a day as you ever get in the Wyoming winter. We headed west from Laramie without a care in the world. There was that sign, but we didn't pay much attention to it. Pretty soon we began to pay attention to it as we encountered a motorist from California whose car had been blown off the road. Still, there was a passerby to help him back on the pavement, and we figured that was as bad as it would get. But farther up the interstate, it got worse. Winds began to buffet the bus, visibility dropped, huge trailer trucks roared by, slinging slush back at us, and snowplows fell in behind, fighting a losing battle with the swirling snow. Then it got a lot worse. The wind rose to what we later learned was 50 miles an hour. Visibility dropped to 0 at times. It was hard to remember that just a few miles down the mountain on the old Highway 30, the sun was shining. We pulled off the interstate to take these pictures and then had an exhausting battle just to make it back to the bus. Soon afterwards, we had to stop filming because there was a 13-car accident right behind us, and we had to rush one of the victims to the hospital in Laramie. Bow present a sad parade of boarded-up cafes, abandoned gas stations, businesses gone broke. The tourists who kept them going now struggle through the blizzards on the interstate to save 14 miles. Folks like Mrs. Gladys White, who runs the Rock River Garage, are still shaking their heads over that. Well, why in the world did they build it up there?
Interstates have their dark side. Interstates are many things, but quiet is not one of them. I live about 100 yards from part of I-5 as it travels through Seattle, and although I can't hear anything in my apartment, the moment you step outside, you can hear the cars, trucks, and buses passing by. Even as it was being built, the new expressways were controversial. In her 1970 book, Superhighway, Super Hoax, Helen Levitt took the interstate to task for its costs, the space it took up, the way it plowed through American city centers, caused traffic rather than easing it, caused pollution, and took money away from better and more effective public transit options. By the numbers, her math makes sense. While the highway can only ever carry 5,000 people per hour, a double-track train line, which takes up less space and is less noisy, can move 50,000. She also points out that when the system is needed to work its best, it works the least. Everyone has been in traffic jams, especially at rush hour. In bigger cities, rush hour can start as early as 3 p.m. and last until 7. That's 4 hours of clogged roads, slow-moving cars, extra pollution, and frustration on the part of drivers. She cited a premium bus service project in Peoria, Illinois, that picked up and dropped off people from their front doors and delivered them to work. It was popular, and riders even reported feeling happier. While the bus service already ran routes in these areas, the convenience of the premium bus service gained the bus service triple the customers. Fast forward to today, and most major cities have some kind of public transit system, including buses and trains. But America's still woefully behind other developed nations when it comes to mass transit. Helen Levitt also talked about how, in the original 1944 plan, interstates weren't going to enter cities. They were going to go around them and leave city centers intact. However, by the time 1956 rolled around and the law was set to be passed, the federal government allowed interstates to be built both in urban and rural centers. The interstate was an integral part of the mid-century urban renewal movement. You've probably heard that phrase before. City leaders saw the flush budgets for the interstate system as a way to renew their communities. Around this time, many cities were trying to prop up ailing downtowns. People had fled to the suburbs, and even by the late 50s, urban blight was a problem. City leaders were determined to modernize cities. Tacky facades were applied to historic buildings. Metal or plastic panels were common. The old pre-war look was getting covered over with the materials of the future. City leaders often used the interstate to get rid of blight. Unfortunately, that usually came at the expense of communities of color. Any poor community was ripe for destruction as local leaders picked the route the new highways would take across their cities. Neighborhoods oftentimes were simply torn apart. One of the biggest problems with the interstate, or as I call it, the dark side of the interstate, is its effect on urban neighborhoods, particularly in communities of color. The highways were built in poor neighborhoods as a way to get rid of the quote-unquote slums. Highways were also oftentimes used as part of disastrous urban renewal projects to wantonly tear cities apart and cause new modernity so people who lived in the suburbs and wanted to drive into the city but no longer live there could do so easily. This also happened at the expense of people who still lived in the city. The route of the interstates in cities took no thought to how people use cities, how people got around, what mobility would be like, how other people who weren't driving on the interstate would interact with it or move across it or through those spaces. And in any city, you can see the record of this. Here in Seattle, for example, there was a stairway where you could walk from downtown to Lake Union, and people used to walk down it for a morning swim. Well, that big staircase was in the way of I-5, and so, well, you can imagine what happened. Out the staircase went, and through went I-5. In Denver, a historic community of Hispanic people on the east side of Denver was plowed straight through by I-70, and in back east where there were already dense functioning cities, the situation was even worse. Anytime in New York City they needed to get rid of a neighborhood, an interstate went right through. In fact, it was famous urbanists of the mid-century who worked hard to stop some of the more elaborate highway projects. And now some of them are even being torn down and torn out as people realize that the interstate is good for cars, but very good for anyone or anything else. Like so many other things in this country, the interstate even has a racist past. In this article from the Metropole blog, They have an interesting couple paragraphs here about interstates in the South. It says here, while some highway routing through white neighborhoods is unavoidable, state and local highway engineers found it politically desirable to avoid as many white neighborhoods as possible. African Americans and other people of color lacked political power, and in many places were actively and violently targeted, so routing highways through their neighborhoods became not just a byproduct of highway routing, but a goal of it. This was described as the removal of urban blight, a condition validated through other planning documents and tools of oppression, such as redlining. In some places, especially the South, state highway directors and local public officials were active in and affiliated with white supremacist organizations. Some African American neighborhoods were targeted for interstate highway construction by these white supremacist public officials because of the civil rights activism within the community, including for school integration and voting. The municipalities were complicit and aided through zoning and comprehensive planning. The states were complicit and aided through route planning and design. The federal government was complicit and aided through funding, route approvals, and other federal programs such as urban renewal. Perhaps nowhere is emblematic of the effect of white supremacy in highway routing as Montgomery, Alabama, where Sam Englehart, planter and ginner from the Shorter, cut his teeth in racist policymaking when he invented gerrymandering as a strategy to disenfranchise the African American voters of Tuskegee. Englehart was also the head of the Alabama White Citizens Council, a hate group. After he was promoted to director of the Alabama Highway Department, he rerouted the freeway extension of I-65 to destroy the African American neighborhood and business district of West Montgomery, in which Rosa Parks, E.D. Nixon, and others lived, and rerouted I-85 to separate the HBCU Alabama State University from its residential neighborhood of distinguished African American merchants, doctors, and faculty, and civil rights intelligentsia. Englehart intended specifically to target the home of Ralph David Abernathy, African American civil rights leader and Baptist minister. As Abernathy wrote to President Kennedy, "Mr. President, if this route for I-85 is approved, it will destroy one of the best Negro neighborhoods in the South and make for a hazardous condition near the local Negro college, a high school, and an elementary school. My home will almost be in the center of this route. The destruction of this neighborhood will only aid the segregationists in their attempt to make the Negro vote as ineffective as possible." In 1957, 3 weeks after the end of the Montgomery bus boycott and just before I-85 was rerouted through Abernathy's house, First Baptist Church, where Abernathy served as minister, was bombed along with 3 others nearby. No one was hurt, but the church was severely damaged. The church was also the site of the siege of First Baptist, following the arrival of Freedom Riders in 1961, who were met with violence as the Greyhound bus station in downtown Montgomery. The church was besieged by 3,000 whites who threatened to burn it down. In the basement, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, while bricks were thrown through windows and tear gas drifted inside. The event played a crucial part in the desegregation of interstate travel. Although Abernathy's home was ultimately saved because of the removal of an interchange in 1965, thousands of others were not so lucky. Isaac Scott Hathaway, a registered voter and director of the ceramics program at Alabama State University, who broke a major racial barrier when he introduced ceramics at the all-white Auburn University, lost his home to I-85. Other people who are largely unknown to history, such as Annie Mae Snipes, Eugene Jackson, Winfred Meadows, and Augusta McCaney, all of whom overcame violence and terror when they became registered African-American voters, lost their homes to interstate highways. The freeway was ultimately constructed just feet from Abernathy's home at one of the main gateways to Alabama State University. In front of it is a historic marker that tells the story of this violent era in American planning and engineering, and of the destruction of the neighborhood in which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Reverend Ralph Abernathy once lived. This intentional and personal violence was not veiled, but an overt dimension of engineering and planning's white supremacist power. Thousands of small businesses were destroyed, families displaced, and property devalued in not only the singular sweep of freeway construction, but in the enduring trend of disinvestment that has sabotaged the health and well-being of African American Montgomery citizens for generations to come. One of the, I think, interesting things that I found in all of my research on the interstate system and reading Helen Levitt's book was not only how controversial interstates were at the time, but how incredibly destructive building the system was by going through cities rather than around them. It was rumored, although this was not proven, that President Eisenhower didn't know that interstates were going to go through cities until they were building I-95 in Washington, D.C., and realized what had happened and how dangerous it would be, but by that time it had already been done. It was a rumor, not sure if it's true, but I do wonder, given how it happened, what he would have thought of these roads and these spaces going through and across cities, and especially how it was done by destroying any neighborhood the local white leadership just simply didn't like. One of the most important things that happened with the interstate system as kind of part of the more difficult side of the construction of the interstate system was highway beautification. Now, this was first promoted by First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson. The interstate system because it took up so much space, it tended to attract not much development around it. Remember, you can't just turn off an interstate to a motel or anything else like the U.S. highway system. You have to get off at an exit and get onto a local road. So the land around interstates, particularly outside of cities, tends to not have a lot around it. Well, this tended to lead to a lot of junkyards and refuse and trash and litter, and pretty soon driving along the interstates was just depressing and sad. Also, companies, in order to capture the marketing potential of people traveling in one direction in their cars, put up billboard after billboard after billboard along the highway. In fact, there are some stretches of highway where that's still the case. I always know I'm in certain parts of the country when I start seeing billboards against abortion, or against gay marriage, or for religion. Mostly in the South. Anyway, highway beautification came along in the late 60s into early 70s and was looking at trying to landscape the interstate system better, get rid of those junkyards, and control the number of billboards along America's highways so it wasn't completely just a free-for-all. It was an important aspect of improving the highway system, even though the damage to neighborhoods and cities had already been done. Now we're going to break away and hear a little bit of an interview on more about this history of urbanization, highway beautification, all this sort of thing with Joseph Rodriguez at the University of Wisconsin. Here's an interview I did with him a while ago. But it's a very important history of the interstate and is going to help us learn a lot more about the history of these highways and why they've been so damaging. When you feel comfortable, go ahead.
Okay, I'm Joseph Rodriguez. I am a historian at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where I am also in the Urban Studies program there, and I teach in history and urban studies. And I teach the history of the United States. I teach courses on urban history, and I'm also teaching courses on Latino history and on Asian American history as well.
When they were planning the interstate system, do you think there was a clear intent to, one, put interstates through cities, because there seems to be some controversy about that, and two, to basically only put these highways in poor neighborhoods? How insidious and intentional was it, or was it accidental?
Well, I think it's partly economics. The intent was to take the revenue they had and to use that revenue to build these highways. And so oftentimes the cheaper land was in poor neighborhoods or in industrial areas. Also, the location of these industrial areas, tended to be near water. And so because of suburbanization, the middle class was beginning to leave the city. And in many of these neighborhoods then were transitioning to poor residents, often non-white. And so I think it's kind of simplistic to say that certain populations were targeted. That's not the only story. I think in some cases that was true. But it did just sort of coincidentally, or the timing of it was such that there were many different kinds of changes going on. So, for example, a lot of these industrial districts, um, companies were moving out, moving to the suburbs as well. Um, and there was dilapidated housing, working class housing that city leaders felt should be, demolished. Now, there were clear situations where, uh, because of politics, because of non-white residents having less political power, that neighborhoods were targeted. Uh, but that wasn't the only thing that happened. The other thing that happened was that in some cases, white urban leaders were concerned about the expansion of Black areas because Blacks were moving up from the South to places like Milwaukee, and some of these so-called ghetto areas were expanding. And so the freeway was used sort of to demarcate a separation between the races. So it wasn't just displacement, it was also sort of creating borders or boundaries around certain neighborhoods.
So much for wrong side of the tracks. It was now
Right,
wrong side of the interstate.
right. Exactly. Yes.
What do you think the impact of putting interstates through cities has had on the American city?
Well, it's had quite a few impacts, and a lot of them were negative. It really made because freeways are so large, it made large swaths of the city really unproductive. You couldn't really develop the land, and so in some ways it impoverished large parts of the city. And there was no tax revenue. It also speeded, some would argue, suburbanization. And when you look at sort of the decline of department stores and the decline of urban commercial areas, a lot of that was then sprouted up on the suburbs. And part of that was because of the freeway system. It made large swaths of the city really uninhabitable. No one wanted to live near a freeway. There's pollution, there's noise, and so it really made large parts of the city pretty uninhabitable. On the other hand, as far as urban leaders were concerned, this was a way to preserve downtown districts, get suburban middle class people who worked in the city, get them to and from the city. But as freeways now are being torn down in some cases, like in Milwaukee, a freeway segment was torn down. um, there's sort of this revelation that you really don't need a freeway once you're in a city. A boulevard is fine. A boulevard that maybe where you can go 40 miles an hour, 30 miles an hour is quite efficient. And so there's been sort of this change of attitude toward uh, simply focusing on efficiency and movement. Now it's like, well, maybe the aesthetics are important, and in some ways that really wasn't in the minds of a lot of freeway builders, right? That the lakefront or the waterfront could be an aesthetic, an environmentally pleasing place where parks and people would want to go. It was just traffic engineers just said, uh, how can we speed motorists as quickly as possible through the city? Now, there's much more environmental consciousness. Uh, I think about San Francisco, where they built the Embarcadero Freeway right along the port, right along the bay, and it was a working port. It was an industrial area. At the time in the 50s, people thought, well, this is an industrial area. Who cares, that the freeway goes right along the waterfront? But now it's a whole different attitude toward the waterfront. It's seen as a resource for not shipping anymore. There's not much shipping that goes on in San Francisco. It's now a place for pleasure, for recreation, and that's brought a whole different attitude toward freeways. And of course, the Embarcadero was torn down, and the waterfront has flourished.
Yeah, so now I've in my process of researching for this, I basically found out like the interstate system as such has reached the end of its useful lifetime. And now it's time basically for a rebuild. And do you think in the process of rebuilding and improving and all this type of thing with President Biden's infrastructure budget. Do
Yeah.
you think there's going to be any will to think about how to repair American cities and move these highways or bury them or whatever have you?
Hmm. Well, I mean, as you know, in Oakland, after the Loma Prieta earthquake, the residents of West Oakland rose up and said, "We do not want this freeway rebuilt where it was built through our neighborhood." And instead, it was routed through the Oakland port at great expense. But that was a way to revive a Black neighborhood in West Oakland. And it was pretty successful. The neighborhood is doing much better than when there was a freeway going right through it. And so here in Milwaukee, right now, there's a huge debate about whether to expand I-94 through downtown Milwaukee. And it's the transportation officials and even a Democratic governor supports expansion, adding lanes to this freeway. And they make arguments about jobs. They make arguments about Milwaukee City, that Milwaukee is needs the economic development. But Black residents and environmentalists are united against adding lanes in Milwaukee. They want to reconstruct the road because it is falling apart, but they want to keep it in the same footprint as it was before. And there was another project here in Milwaukee where a interchange was reconstructed, and the DOT did make an effort to hire inner city residents as workers on these projects, and I think that's something that uh, people have talked about reparations, for what has gone wrong in the past in terms of destroying Black neighborhoods. If there is highway transportation construction, Black residents and poor residents should get those jobs, should have priority. So there is a jobs argument. On the other hand, people make the argument that there's jobs in transportation, mass transit as well, bus lanes, and mass transit systems also provide jobs. So
How do you think COVID has changed the calculus on this?
it's really made it a lot harder to argue that freeway should be expanded. Uh, that's
Really?
that's clear in Milwaukee that one of the points, that the transportation officials who want to expand the freeway say we need expanded capacity. We need to have, we're going to have more trucking, we're going to have more autos. With COVID, that argument really doesn't fly because it's clear that that capacity can change based on how many people have to commute. And if there's fewer people commuting, you don't need as many lanes. So I think that's been part of it. Also, the environmentalists have really pointed to COVID and said, "Hey, look at the air is cleaner with fewer autos on the road, and fewer people have asthma, fewer people are suffering from all these health arguments." Um, I think maybe the counter argument for COVID would be that decentralization is better than centralization, but I think given the fact that COVID has spread pretty much everywhere, that argument, even though it was made initially, that look at New York City is suffering, and that's a densely populated city, and that's why we should all just move to the suburbs, and that argument kind of went away when COVID got to the suburbs.
Yeah, and I think the reason I ask is because I here in Seattle, at great expense passed Sound Transit 3, and we're building the light rail system we should have built 40 years ago, and that got built in Atlanta instead. And I've kind of been worried that with COVID, it's like we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars to build a light rail system we may not need.
Right.
Because people are not going to, I think it's going to be very hard to get people to get on mass transit in a post-COVID environment.
Yes, right.
And I'm sure you know that we have a major transportation issue here that has been ongoing for decades.
Right. Well, you're right. I mean, that is a good counter argument that people used their private automobiles and felt safer in those private automobiles, and I think COVID kind of went both ways. Um, but I, I I do think that with more people working at home, yeah, you're right. Mass transit's kind of a harder sell now too, but definitely highways are a harder sell. If more people can work from home, which I think was proven to be the case, that so many people that were commuting really didn't have to. Now it's a matter of getting businesses to agree to allow workers to work, 2 or 3 days a week at home, and that should make commuting less, uh, you know, uh, less onerous on our transportation system. There's a lot of other reasons for mass transit, especially for light rail. There's economic development reasons, job reasons. Trying to get more shoppers in downtown, and Milwaukee built what's called the HOP, which is a light rail system, a very small one. And the Republicans just denigrated it as wasteful. Um, yeah, actually, the local Indian casino has been paying for all admissions on this light rail system. I don't think it's had much impact on the transit, on ridership. I don't know how big ridership is, but it's part of Milwaukee trying to redevelop its downtown and get more people to shop and live downtown. And there's been a huge increase in people living downtown in Milwaukee. Um, so that's another reason why maybe, that the highway system, the argument that we need to add more lanes is not, it's not really convincing anymore. If more people are living in the city, then again, commuting is going to be a little bit reduced.
Yeah, they here in Seattle, they talked about expanding I-5 under the convention center where it's only about 3 lanes. And they came along and said, when we built that, because the convention center goes over the top of I-5. So like when you're in the convention center, if there was a piece of glass in the floor, you would see the cars passing under your feet. And they said, well, we don't really know if we can expand it. Those piles were put into bedrock. We might have to use dynamite, and even then we don't know if we can move them. And they gave up on that idea and decided to expand the convention center instead. Which means the highway will never get any wider because there's a building on top of it. So that's the end of that discussion.
Yeah.
When it comes to these kind of various and sundry plans, what have you observed? Like, different cities have been trying different things. What have you observed has been the most effective strategy for, like, which American city is kind of doing it right when it comes to transportation? And is that formula like something we could adopt more widely?
That's a tough one, because every city has a little bit different situation in terms of number. I mean, for example, I think New York has a very efficient system, and a lot of people take mass transit in New York City. San Francisco, same thing. A lot of people take the mass transit system, the bus system, the BART, right, for example.
Right.
And obviously, though, in those places, there's so many people that even though I think the transit systems work pretty efficiently, there's still a lot of problems, and especially there are problems financially because mass transit trains are expensive and they need constant maintenance. They need periodic, complete overhauls. Um, and so even though I would say, for example, the Bay Area, I think the Bay Area's transit system is pretty efficient, the mass transit system. Now, the highways are terrible, I mean, in terms of congestion. LA is trying to increase its mass transit ridership because the highways are so congested. So I can't really point to any city where I think, aha, they're doing it right. For example, like Houston, everything's so spread out that that people can drive pretty well, and but that's a whole different kind of situation than say San Francisco or New York or Chicago. Chicago has a pretty good transit system. They have a lot of different trains. They have, Amtrak. They have the commuter rail, the subway, the bus system. It works pretty well, but again, the highways are jam packed. At least they were before COVID. So every place a little bit different. Every place has struggles with you know with congestion and trying to balance the cost of mass transit against the need to get people out of cars.
Yeah.
And so
Yes. In terms of one of the things I have noticed in my research about the interstate is there seems to be this philosophy that the interstate is bland and boring.
Mhm.
Not much people writing about the intrinsic romance and excitement of these very particular type of roads. There
Right.
seems to be this whole idea that they're bland, they're boring. Charles
Right.
Kuralt said you can now successfully drive from one end of America to the other and see nothing.
Right.
Why do you think people have this sort of attitude towards the interstate like that? Like people find them useful, but there's nothing romantic about them. They're practical,
Yeah.
but
Well,
nothing else. What's
yeah,
with that?
maybe I'll just push back a little bit. There's a book by David Broadsley called L.A. Freeway,
Hmm.
where he does a look at sort of the art of the freeway, the design of it, sort of the clover leaf, and it is a pretty positive view of at least the way the aesthetics of the freeway. And I remember when I grew up in the Bay Area and the MacArthur Freeway, which went along the East Bay from Oakland down through San Leandro, Hayward. Beautiful freeway. I mean, it had trees, beautiful trees, and beautiful greenery along the way. And when I was growing up, it was never really crowded. Everyone took the Nimitz, which was god awful because it had and MacArthur actually prohibited trucking. So it was it was sort of almost this perfect blend of nature and culture, if you will, nature and the highway. Um, I think you're right. I think people who are stuck in traffic tend not to have a very positive attitude toward the freeway. But you're right. The ability to drive without stopping and the idea that you can go anywhere on this interstate is, I think, sort of a positive thing, and it really transformed America. From suburbanization to the trucking industry to the decentralization of factories, uh, and it brought a lot of the natural part of this country into range of Americans who had an automobile. I grew up camping. My family every year would go on some couple major camping trips, and throughout the West. We went up to Seattle, we went up to Banff and Lake Victoria, and we took the highway, and we went out to the desert, and we went out throughout the West. So that I think the highway made it possible. And if you talk to Europeans, where if you ever wanted to go anywhere, especially in England, you took forever to get anywhere.
Right, yeah.
And so I think when elites, perhaps, and this some of this has to do with the environmental movement, and pollution and sort of denigrating the highways for those kinds of environmental uh, problems, which definitely air pollution is a problem, no doubt about it. And of course, you had, I think about Lady Bird Johnson, right, the president's wife, and who led this campaign to beautify the highways because a lot of these the worst commercial signage was located along the highway. Areas of uh, auto recycling centers were located along the highway. So there was an effort to beautify, but I think you're right. I think there is a romance to the open road, which is also part of America's culture, right? You can think about Jack Kerouac and people writing about traveling, and that is part of who we are. So the freeway is part of that, but some of the negative consequences are also apparent. And we didn't talk about
Yeah.
carnage. The number of people that are killed every year in the automobile is pretty amazing, and it's something we just deal with it. We kind of accept it. But the human carnage is severe. So
No, certainly. I mean, these days it's less deaths and more injuries because cars have gotten safer, which means people live,
yeah,
but with the associated health problems. Interstates still kill about 40,000 people a year, but there's even, more people that end up with just,
yeah,
injuries or long-term health effects from having been in a car accident and
yeah.
having lived because cars are so much better than they used to be.
Yeah,
Um,
cars are bigger too, and that's really made
and more
pedestrian,
powerful, yeah.
and that's made walking more dangerous and biking more dangerous, and yeah, if you get hit by an SUV, it's one thing versus a smaller car. So, but yeah, that's still. But you're right. But with airbags and seat belts and everything else, it is safer, in many ways.
Absolutely. What do you think the future of the interstate is as such?
Well, I mean,
What does
I
the
think.
interstate system look like 50 years from now?
Well, I hope it looks something like what the Bay Area is doing, where if there is a new freeway built, they leave the center open so that a train can go through. And in this case, BART would go through the freeway as well. So I would say mixed use, uh, freeway and mass transit built, or at least equally valued, because um, I think, especially in cities where, you have to move massive numbers of people. Um, the freeway system, I guess, would just continue, right? And there's going to be high cost to reconstruct, to maintain these freeway systems, but we're talking about electric cars. People are still going to drive.
Right.
Ford has an electric truck now, so the idea that
Yes.
suddenly we're not going to have cars is kind of silly. I mean, I think the economy will continue to produce, and Americans will continue to want to own a car. I'm amazed at people that talk about a carless future, or or even everyone should have an electric car, and I think that's fine to have an electric car, but do you want to pull a boat or a camper with electric car? Maybe at some point you will. I think Americans will want to do that. It's a big country. People want to travel, explore it, and it's kind of hard to do it on a train. Amtrak, you can see part of it, but you can't see a lot of it that way. So I think the highway system will continue, and people will continue to debate expanding freeways in cities, just like this. It's happening in Milwaukee now. Um, I do think, though, that in cities there's going to be more flexibility. There's going to be congestion pricing, you know uh, where you pay a toll every time you drive. Let's say a higher toll during rush hour, a lower toll off peak hour. Where and this is a real problem with the gas tax, because electric cars don't use gas, and gas tax is the main funding source for highway construction and maintenance.
Right.
So if you're not paying the gas tax, they have to figure out how to charge a user fee for those who use the roads. So there's been a lot of proposals of, well, maybe we should charge by mileage. So every year your car would be checked, and you would enter how many miles you've driven. If you've driven 10,000 miles that year, then you pay a certain tax. Uh, some people say that's intrusive. That how much I drive is my own personal business. Um, but others say that toll roads, if you've gone through a toll road lately, you don't have to stop. if you have a meter or license plate, they can read your license plate and charge you something. So that's another way to pay for highways. So right now there's a real huge debate about how to pay for, the reconstruction or the construction of highways, because so many people are buying electric cars, and even hybrids. They get such high gas mileage that the gas tax fund, the highway trust fund, is in deficit. Um, some argue, well, that some of that money is being siphoned off for mass transit, and it shouldn't be. But that's going to be an ongoing debate.
Well, yes, and that was one of the things that I found out in my research is that as the worst thing for the highway fund is that cars have gotten so efficient
Yeah.
that like the amount of revenue, especially since the 90s, has gone down because we keep raising fuel efficiency standards and mileage standards, and
Mhm.
therefore, cars use less fuel and therefore people pay less tax. And so it just
Right.
kind of becomes this revolving cycle of not enough money to keep the
Yeah.
highways going.
Right. And then, of course, Republicans now, don't want to raise taxes for anything. Uh,
No, heaven forfend you raise a tax.
one of the last, I think the last time the highway gas tax was raised in 1993. Um, that's,
Yes.
and even before that, it was George H.W. Bush who increased the gas tax, and he was a Republican, and then Clinton did it. But now, any Republican proposes increasing the gas tax, even Democrats won't propose that. And it was kind of silly when gas was so low recently. Last 5 or so years, it's been very low, and it would have been the perfect time to increase the gas tax, but politicians didn't have the guts to do something like that. But the electric vehicle movement will create a problem, and that's less revenue for the roads.
Yes. What do you think about the idea of ending interstates outside of cities and then starting it back up once you leave the city? Sort of getting the highway out of the city altogether.
Yeah, I think that's, and I mean, one problem with that idea is that the way a lot of these highways are configured is that they're kind of throughways. They go, I know in Milwaukee, for example, I-43 goes from Chicago to Green Bay, and it goes right through Milwaukee. And so if you have any kind of trucking industry, that would create an awful situation of semis backed up trying to move through the city. Now, there are belt lines around cities, which I think probably trucking industry says that would just lengthen the time that it takes to travel. But so I think some freeways can come down, and they are coming down in some cities, and in some places where, like I said, in Oakland, where the residents in West Oakland really rebelled against the reconstruction of it. But the freeway had to be reconstructed. It had to be linked from the East Bay to San Francisco. There had to be a route through Oakland. They chose the port. So I think there are ways to thread freeways through cities that are more uh, favorable to the urban population. Um, I think a lot of freeways can come down, and I think people are surprised, right, that especially these smaller trunk lines like the Park East in Milwaukee came down, and no one knows the difference. They built a little boulevard. It was underutilized, and it's fine that it came down. So um, that's I think a lot of residents, a lot of urban leaders are in favor of eliminating freeways in certain areas because they see that they can redevelop those areas into housing, into shopping, and create more revenue for the city than having a freeway run through it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I don't know if I'm going to necessarily use this in the episode, but if
Okay.
you want to let us know where we can find you online or a book to pick up or whatever have you, then now would be the time to do that.
Well, I have a recent book, but it's more on Milwaukee. It's Bootstrap New Urbanism. It's more of an academic book. I'm not sure people will want to buy that, but I I enjoyed the podcast and I enjoyed talking to you.
One thing is clear. America would be a more dense country if it weren't for the interstate. The interstate allowed suburban sprawl in a way that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. The contributions to suburban sprawl cannot be understated. Interstates were specifically designed to help people get in and out of cities, anticipating that people would workshop and be entertained in cities but would often not live there. Mass transit options were often eliminated in favor of cars. Interstates didn't destroy mass transit as such. Most mass transit was still privately owned. Bus companies did successfully get out of the gas tax to pay for the interstates, but low ridership numbers and the increased people buying cars and using cars to drive on the interstates and live in the suburbs where mass transit didn't go honestly drove most of them out of business. You'll notice now that most mass transit is owned by cities and counties and is subsidized by the taxpayer. Most of the time, private companies just don't get enough riders because the car is supreme. And if there's any kind of one thing we've learned from this interview is that this has come at a cost. The interstate system doesn't just cost money and maintenance and repair and all this type of thing. It costs money in healthcare, human lives, neighborhoods, and our society. As convenient and as amazing and spectacular as interstates are, their cost is steep. And that is something that we've yet to acknowledge. I'll admit, when I set out to create this podcast episode, I anticipated something much more positive coming out of it. I was excited and interested, and I thought it was going to be, a lot of facts and data about, how wonderful highways were. But by the time I was done, I can only look at the interstate within a new light. I see it for its problems. I see it for its issues, how it's destroyed American cities, how it affects people. My whole perspective of the interstate system has changed. So that leaves us with one question. What's the future of the interstate? The interstate, it's true, it was only actually made to last about 50 years. We have gotten our use out of the system, which means that it's time to rethink how we fund it, where it goes, how it's used, and how we might use it in the future. In 2018, the Future Interstate Report resulted from a request by Congress and the U.S. Department of Transportation. The Transportation Research Board, a program unit of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, put together a committee to come up with some new ideas for the interstate system. And I want to read a couple of these to you because I think they're interesting. 1. Create a federal program dedicated to renewing and modernizing interstate highways over the next 20 years. The federal government leads in articulating and furthering the national purpose of the system in partnership with states that prioritize and make specific improvements as asset owners, builders, operators, and maintainers. Number 2 is develop criteria to meet demands to extend the interstate system's reach and remedy adverse impacts from past investments. 3 is to systemically assess the condition of interstate bridges and pavement foundations. 4 is to raise the federal motor fuels tax to provide sufficient revenue for near-term system investments. 5, allow states and metro areas to toll more on interstate highways. 6, explore new funding mechanisms, including mileage-based use fees. 7, develop interstate simulation tools and databases to monitor and model impacts of investments. 8, plan for the transition to electric, automated, and connected vehicles. 9, build resilience to extreme weather and climate change into long-term improvement planning. And 10, seek ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from interstate traffic. I think this is a good place to start, and certainly in the light of the recent infrastructure bill, I'm sure that those ideas are going to be used by the Department of Transportation to figure out how to plan highway teardowns, expansion, repair, all those things that mentioned. Most of the focus of today has been on the downsides of the interstate. The fact that urban highways tore neighborhoods apart and made quick work of minority neighborhoods has become the dominant narrative about the interstate. Solutions range from burying urban highways to eliminating them altogether and letting the interstates end as they approach cities and begin as the city gives way to rural areas. The future of transportation has much less to do with driving cars than in the past. This year, the Biden administration, in its infrastructure proposal, allocates significant funding for new dedicated passenger rail lines that would be the beginning of a high-speed rail network. The environmental impacts of car transportation are now well understood, and the trend towards using cars less and using transportation options that can move more people for less fuel input cost is now much more popular. High-speed rail trains would use electricity, which could be made with green technology. The age of the car-centered transportation plan is over. Slate reported in a 2015 article that in order to stop subsidizing car travel, the interstate system should involve more taxes, more tolls, and more expense to reduce driving and encourage other types of transportation. And it appears that the committee who studied this would agree with them. However, that could just lead to more air travel without a proper rail system. And we'll get into rail travel later this season, but it's important to think about all the ways people are going to get around, both short distances and long distances, and work to create options that don't include things that create more pollution. I think the one question I'm asking at the end of this is, what's going to happen to urban highways? They're steeped in racism. They've destroyed neighborhoods. They take up precious space in cities that, need more space for housing and for people and all this type of thing. I think we have to wonder what's going to happen to them. There are some teardown projects planned. There are cities who are just seeing that those highways are no longer useful or helpful. And I think we're going to see that as a trend more and more as time goes on. Do I think they're going to get rid of I-5 in Seattle anytime soon? Doubtful. But it's important to think about what the potential future of the interstate could be. I don't think the interstate's going anywhere anytime soon, but it will look very different than in the past. And the way it's used is certainly beginning to change as America leaves the car behind for other transportation options. I don't think urban highways are going anywhere fast either, same with cars, but the pressure was going to be to move away from this expensive system and towards a system that prioritizes people over cars. That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.